This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Educast. Get the support you need and find out why more and more teachers are choosing Educast at educast.co.uk/here for you.
Hello and welcome to the award-winning SecEd podcast. I'm Matt Bromley, an education author and advisor with over 20 years of experience in teaching and leadership, including as a secondary school head teacher. And I'm your host for this edition. And this time, we're discussing exam anxiety. We'll explore ways of helping our students to better prepare for exams and ways to minimise the stress that can sometimes be caused by high-stakes assessments. We'll look, for example, at the part that mock exams and past papers might play, as well as walkthroughs, to help to automate some of those exam hall routines that can be stressful to students. We'll look as well at explicitly teaching study skills and revision techniques to help students to better prepare. We'll also look at what causes anxiety. What are the telltale signs to look out for? When does anxiety become diagnosable? And what can we, as teachers and leaders, do to support our students? How important, for example, is sleep and healthy eating in helping students to better prepare? This episode has been produced in partnership with Educast, and if you'd like to find out more about their work, listen at the end of this podcast. So, lots to discuss this time, and with me, I've got 4 experts in this field, and they are...
Hi, my name's Ben Hewitson. I'm a sociology teacher at a school in Suffolk called Kesgrave High School. I've also been an examiner for WJEC, and why I'm on this podcast, I suppose, because I have an awful lot of contact with students, and we've all been through this pandemic together, but I've recently stepped down as head of sociology and have been taking the last sort of 4 years worth of students through their examination process.
Hello, my name is Fran Lantongwe. I'm also a social sciences teacher working at a school in Norfolk. I wanted to join the podcast because I work with a lot of exam classes, have a lot of students who are experiencing quite high levels of anxiety following the pandemic. I'm very interested to take part, see what I can add to the discussion, but also hear what my colleagues have got to add.
My name is Natashas. I'm an author, broadcaster and campaigner. My job takes me into about 3 schools a week throughout the UK and sometimes beyond, and I deliver talks and conduct research on issues related to mental health. And the reason that I wanted to contribute to this podcast is because I wrote a book called Yes You Can Ace Your Exams Without Losing Your Mind.
Hello, I'm Dr. Rachel Dodge and I work for WJC Educast. I joined as subject officer for psychology and my PhD is looking at well-being of students, and we're really excited about being here today to talk about how we as an awarding organisation try to support students with anxiety.
This podcast was recorded on the 8th of March 2022 over Zoom, so as always, apologies in advance for any ambient noises off. I began by asking all my guests if, when we consider that exams can be stressful, they can cause anxiety, whether we need them at all, or might there be better ways of assessing our students?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's a brave question to ask. We've actually seen a real desire from schools and colleges to return to exams. I think that there's a recognition that they're the fairest way for a learner to show what they know, understand and can do. They definitely bring a consistency of approach and more of a level playing field, which is really important for learners, as everyone is assessed in the same way at the same time. They can also help to ensure that standards are maintained year on year and that grades awarded to learners in the past, present or future are of equal value. I suppose as well, planning and preparing for exams is also a real life skill in itself, and it can help equip learners with important skills for their future, whether that's at university or for a future career.
Thank you for that. Natasha, same question to you. So, of course, exams are not perfect. They do cause anxiety, as we will explore through the course of this discussion. But do you agree that they are the best leveller for students, those who are disadvantaged versus those who are not, but also the best, fairest system of assessing students' capabilities?
I think that you have to be really mired in the nuance to answer a question like this, because there is a place for exams in the way that we assess students, of course. But what we've seen over past years pre-pandemic is a move to greater and greater percentages of a pupil's overall learning being assessed just by exams. And that not only advantages young people whose parents can afford for them to be privately tutored, it also doesn't reward a pupil's progress. It doesn't acknowledge where they started. It doesn't acknowledge their potential. And I also think that it only really rewards one type of learning, which is the ability to absorb and regurgitate a fairly arbitrary set of facts. And that doesn't leave much room for critical thinking then. And I worry that if we rely too heavily on exams, or if schools become an exam factory environment, then critical thinking gets squeezed out of the education process.
Sam, do you want to pick up on that? So exams have a place, but perhaps as part of a wider system of assessment. What's your view on that?
I do think it's a good question. My own career has spanned the last 31 years now. When I started teaching English back in 1990, we actually had what was called 100% coursework. All the work was completed, by students under coursework conditions, and it worked. But it stopped working at the point that the accountability became, so high stakes in schools, and that CD border became so critical. And now, of course, it's a sort of grade 4-5 border and the grade 3-4 border as well. And then the incentive is there for schools to inflate, coursework, grades. And I hate to use the word cheat, but I mean, it goes on. So I do think that work completed under exam conditions, controlled exam conditions, should be part of the final grade. It's just whether, what percentage of the final grade. I think it's a real shame, for example, that speaking and listening has gone from GCSE English. I think that's a real shame. But I wouldn't go back to the 100% coursework system that they had in 1990. I don't think that would work today.
I don't think we need exams 100%, but I do think they do play an important role of being a form of sort of standardized summative assessment that everybody has the same kind of situations and parameters. So I do think they need to play a part. And I do wonder, I've only been a teacher now for 7 years, and in my own subject in GCSE and A-level sociology, we don't do coursework. And it does feel that through not doing coursework and focusing solely on exams at the end of a 2-year course, that there are some skills that perhaps students have that aren't recognised, that perhaps are, in my personal opinion, just as important as being able to analyse and evaluate sociological theories or those kind of things. So I think, the long and the short of where I'm at with this is that exams, they're not perfect, but they do need to play a role in the assessment process.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. So not without their difficulties, and should only form a part of that wider assessment of students' capabilities, but they certainly do play a part. And whatever our own views on exams, it's clear that they are not going to go away. They are here to stay. So let's talk about how we can help students then to better prepare for those exams. Now, there's been much talk, of course, over the last couple of years about the impact that COVID has had on students and the lessons that schools might learn from the lockdowns and so on. Now, I'm conscious that I want this podcast to be full of perennial advice, good advice that will last through the years, but we can't ignore the context in which we are speaking today. So let's just tackle that first before we move on to some longer term help and advice. So Ben, I want to stay with you if I can and just ask you what your experience of COVID has been. What has been the impact, and what might we do to help mitigate some of the adverse effects of COVID on students' abilities to sit and succeed in exams?
I think there are so many impacts that COVID has had on students, and with their ability to kind of prepare for their final assessments in whatever way they are. I mean, I think initially the first year of teacher assessed grades was really, as widely publicised, difficult because of the moving of the goalposts here, there and everywhere. I think as last year, as we went through the process again, albeit with a slightly different angle on it, I think that for teachers, we became used to assessing students throughout the year, and I think students became happier with that kind of arrangement on the whole. Certainly from the students that I teach, I actually spoke to a couple of groups before coming on this podcast just about their thoughts on this. I think that one of the real issues obviously was having that lack of face-to-face contact time. I think especially at A-level and GCSE, having your teacher available to ask questions of, and whilst you can be on Zoom or Teams or in my case doing YouTube videos for my students or whatever else, it didn't replace that kind of face-to-face contact you could have with your teachers. And I know that lots of students, despite having access to email and all manner of communications channels with their teachers, still felt alone in the process. And that was a really difficult thing, I think, on a personal level to deal with, having a lot of care and love for the students to not be able to be there for them. I think on the other hand as well, you've got the situation where some students, I think it would probably be fair to say, to a certain extent, were really quite pleased about the COVID context and that they didn't have to sit exams. What we have now, though, is for our students at the top end of A-level, so going through their year 13, going to be doing their year 13 exams in May and June this year, is that they've had very little experience of actually going through that process. And so to come back to something that was mentioned earlier, the stakes are incredibly high, because not only does their 2 years come down to these exams, which is absolutely fine, it's the way it's always been, they've never really been through this process before. And so that adds an extra air of stress and anxiety, because quite frankly, you can't, as many mocks or as many dry run exams as you can do in the classroom, or even putting students in exam halls, they don't replace that literal fear that you get when it's the morning or the afternoon of your exam. And so I think that lacking that experience of actually sitting down in that situation for their GCSE exams, for instance, has also had a big impact on them in terms of how prepared they feel, certainly for this series of exams coming up in summer 22.
Thank you. Dan, same question to you then about the impact that COVID has had on your students. And I suppose just picking up on what Ben said there, it's not just about the amount of, or the depth of curriculum content that has been covered, but also the lack of experience that students have had, including A-level students over the last couple of years, at actually going through the routine of going into an exam hall and so on. What's been the impact on your students?
I certainly echo the things that Ben said. I've got several year 13 classes, and a lot of the students are experiencing extremely high anxiety of this issue, that they really haven't sat very many formal exams at all. The specific things that some of them are worried about is they're just worried that their concentration won't hold out. They're so used, certainly during the lockdown period, to being able to just mute their microphones and their cameras and, just go off for a little bit and do what they wanted and then come back to the lesson. And, I was talking to a student, a good year 13 student yesterday, who said she spends 3 hours a night on TikTok and another couple of hours on Snapchat, and they've just got into those habits. And a lot of them are also working for money. We're in rural Norfolk, and, they work to pay for their cars so that they can get into college, into sixth form college. And they just can't concentrate over sustained periods of time in the way that I think pre-pandemic students found it easier to do. And I think the day of reckoning is fast approaching. And I know in the mocks, some of the year 13 students literally ran out of steam. Their stamina just did not hold up. And had they been through a sort of cycle of GCSE exams, that would have been a very, very different thing. As Ben said, you can do as many mocks as you like, it isn't the same. So it's that really, that sort of that concentration span issue, that fear that their stamina is going to run out. The thought of maybe having 2 2-hour exams in one day is just making young people melt down completely. I can remember back in 1980 doing 2 3-hour A-levels, and don't get me wrong, I didn't enjoy it and it was tough, but I could do it and everyone around me could do it. I think that's becoming harder and harder for young people now, with they're so used to devices pinging at them every few seconds, and that sustained period of concentration really is quite hard to achieve now. That for me is one of the biggest issues.
Thank you. And I'm just staying with you a moment longer. What about those students that would traditionally have access to the arrangements put in place to support them? Has there been an impact there in terms of identifying students that have additional and different needs?
Absolutely. It really has been quite disastrous for some students. My sixth form college takes students from other 11 to 16 schools in the area. And some of them have turned up saying, we were supposed to have extra time for our GCSEs, but, it never happened because of the pandemic and everything. But the access arrangements have changed since last September. It's now much more difficult to get that extra time. It's not just a question of saying, oh, this student has extra time as their normal way of working, so they should have extra time. It doesn't work like that anymore. They have to have letters from a consultant saying that, they've got some particular issue that means they simply can't carry out the exams in the same way as their peers around them. It's much, much more difficult to get that extra time. Whereas had they had extra time for GCSE, it would have been easier then, I think, to follow on and make that happen for A-level. So we've now got some students who are going into their A-level exams with rest breaks in place, but not extra time. And I think that's adding to the anxiety. I really do.
Yeah, thank you for that. Natasha, can I come to you then? So Dan's there set out quite clearly some of the impacts that COVID has had on her students, including their ability to concentrate for extended periods of time in an exam. What would your advice be to teachers and school leaders to better prepare students for sitting exams?
I found what Fran said really interesting, because that's something that I was noticing even before the pandemic with the attention span thing. Young people were telling me, for example, that their homework was taking them far longer than their teachers thought it should take them. And that was in turn impacting their sleep, the amount of sleep and the quality of sleep that they could get, which is, of course, a really fundamental cornerstone of good mental health. And when you interrogate that further, the reason for that is that they're trying to multitask. So they are doing their essay, but they also have chat windows open. They have their phone next to them with the notifications switched on. So I've been trying to, I deliver talks on self-regulation when it comes to social media and being a good digital citizen, because ultimately I think they are going to have an online existence as well as an offline one. That's their experience of the world. So I'm trying to help them to navigate it. And one of the tips that I give them is to try and ring fence time when they're studying, and to have an agreement with their friends that none of us are online between this hour and this hour, so that they are not trying to have their leisure time and their work coexisting, because then they're not fully invested in their work, but they're also not fully getting the joy out of social media. And it is supposed to be a joyful thing. And I think that often we forget that. So that was very interesting to me. In terms of what schools can do, the question that I've been asking young people is, what has the pandemic taught you? Because whilst, of course, I accept that the narrative that's come out of media about this being a lost generation and all the disadvantages that young people have faced is true, or certainly has a lot of truth in it, I don't think that it's terribly helpful for their motivation for them to perceive themselves in that way. So I've been asking young people, what can you do now that you couldn't do 2 years ago? And one of the answers that I'm given is, I learned how to motivate myself to work from home. And that will serve them not only when they're on study leave, it will also serve them if they choose to go to university, because of course you're micromanaged a hell of a lot less in terms of your academic life at university, but also in the world of work, because if you can, the evidence shows that the future of working is going to be partly on site and partly at home for most young people. So I've been saying to them, this is a skill that you have been able to master now, or at least learn what the challenges are now, that will perhaps be an advantage to you as you go through your education and your life.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? It's about trying to avoid the deficit model. Of course, accepting that COVID has not been a positive experience for anyone, but actually there are some positive aspects that perhaps students have been able to learn from that. It's an interesting point. Just to come back to your earlier point about, in some of your talks, about supporting students to become more sort of metacognitive, self-regulated with their social media use. I'm thinking also about helping them to become more self-regulated as learners. Is this something that you feel should be explicitly taught to them? Is it something that should form part of a curriculum?
I'm always wary of saying this should be taught, because I know that most schools barely have time for the things that they have to teach already. And I think when we're talking about what would ideally be on the curriculum, what we're actually talking about is a fundamental restructure of the curriculum itself, almost starting from scratch and redesigning it. But with that proviso, then yes, I think how you learn is equally as important as what you learn. And teaching them self-regulation is going to be a super important life skill in the technological age.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting point. We will come back to that when we look at ways that, not just because of COVID, but generally speaking, we can better support students to prepare for the academic side of sitting exams. Fran, just before I move on, do you want to just come back in there and respond to what Natasha has said?
Yes, I was very interested to hear what Natasha had to say about students learning that they needed to sort of self-regulate and how to study from home. My experience is that has happened, but also there's been some students who've gone the other way and who had originally thought maybe they would go to university, who now know that that's not right for them because they really don't want to and feel they can't self-regulate. So that's quite interesting. We've got a lot of students now in year 13 who are saying, I really want to do an apprenticeship. I want something very structured. And yes, that's partly about student debt and that sort of thing, but that's not all. They say, I don't want to sit on my own in a library and read books and write essays. I don't want to do that. And I'm seeing a much higher number now of my year 13 saying, I don't want to go to uni, which I think is quite interesting.
It is, thank you. Just before we move off COVID, Rachel, can I bring you in here from an exam board's point of view, just to give your view of what you see as being the impact of COVID, good and bad, and what EDUCAS, as an example, can do to support teachers and through them to support students as they sit exams this year for the first time?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Mind has highlighted that over 1 in 3 young people said that their mental health has got worse during the pandemic. And as an example, we've been trying to have open conversations with learners about their anxiety. And I think a lot of what people have been talking about is being able to talk through those worries and those anxieties. So it's interesting what Ben and Fran were saying about, you know, you can do loads of mocks, but they have so many worries about actually what it's like to take an exam. And I think that there has been a great rise in that situational anxiety. And I think it's about allowing learners to ask any question about what it's going to be like. And they might think they're really silly questions. So I remember when I was teaching, kids used to say to me, when I line up, is that when I stop talking? So when do I stop talking, miss, before I go into an exam? And I think it's about having those open conversations about what is it actually going to be like? Where will you sit? When will you know that it started? How will you use your time properly? Make sure that you can see the clock. All those practical things to really help learners kind of like who, especially those that haven't been in this situation before, what that's going to be like. Fran's talked about learners that have got special circs, and they might find that they're actually in a separate room to their friends. They might be in a room with a laptop instead of being in the exam hall, and preparing them for that because they might not have thought that through and how that would actually be. So I think having those what if conversations with learners is really, really important. I think the other thing, and this touches on something that Natasha was saying, that it's about linking it to other aspects of life. Exams, nobody is going to like taking an exam. I don't know if any of us ever like taking exams, but actually if we can compare it to other things that learners are doing, like learning to drive, they might see it in a slightly different way. So it's quite common when you're just about to do your driving test to be taken on the routes that you might be taken on your driving test. And that's just the same as kind of trying to do a mock exam. And I think when we try and explain the skills that they are doing in an exam and how that can be compared to everyday, more practical situations, maybe that can reduce some of the anxiety that they're experiencing.
Actually, you've nicely segued into my next line of questioning there, because what I want to do is focus on broadly speaking, two different aspects of supporting students with exams. The first is about supporting them academically, And the second is about supporting them pastorally. So in terms of pastorally, what I mean by that, and I'm sure you know, but what I want to come on to a little bit later, not just yet, is about the importance of sleep and healthy eating. And then when students are suffering from anxiety or stress, what we can do to support them with that, how we can diagnose that and how early that might be diagnosable, etc. Just park that for the moment, and I want to stick with the academic side of helping students to prepare for the exams. So you've talked there about walkthroughs, for example, to help students to alternate some of those exam hall routines so they know how to line up, when they must stop talking, and so on and so forth. So by all means, come back to that in more detail if you wish, but could I just ask you to expand on that? So what else would you advise that schools do to support students with the academic side of exams, with how to understand the layout of an exam paper, for example, and using the marks available, the amount of space available to give an answer, etc. But also in lessons before exams, the use of past papers and you know, you get the idea. So what can we do to support students academically?
It's really interesting because test anxiety is not a new subject. Pre-pandemic, and most probably just before November 2019, British Psychological Society put together a roundtable event and invited me to talk about how we, from an exam board perspective, help learners to prepare. And I remember in those discussions that one thing that came out a lot from research was that learners are told to revise, but they're not always told how to. And that covers so many aspects, because actually it's not always intuitive revision, and it's also realizing that one size does not fit all. And I think it's about introducing techniques to students, and lots of different techniques, and them allowing them to find what works best for them. So if I can use an example from my daughter, and she'll most probably kill me for doing this, she's at university now in her second year. I remember reading loads of research around writing out your notes is not the best way to revise. But my daughter has done that for her GCSEs, A-levels, and she continues to do that for her degree, and she's getting really good results. So I think it's about accepting that what works for one person might not work for another. I think in terms of reducing anxiety about exams, it's about allowing learners to really understand what that exam paper is going to look like. So I'm sure that Fran and Ben do past papers with their students. I think it's about really talking through even the instructions on the front of the page, looking at the time allocated to the exam paper, having an open discussion with students saying, do you realise you don't have to do it in the order that the exam paper is set out? I remember saying that to students when I was teaching, and they were like, is that against the rules? Of course it's not against the rules. You can do a paper in any order you want to. I think as well, it's about using that specification as your checklist for what you need to learn. And as human beings, we kind of tend to stick to our comfort zone. So a lot of the time, learners revise areas they actually know really well because they don't want to push themselves out of their comfort zone. So by maybe using the specification as a checklist for a revision, pushing yourself out of that comfort zone and looking at the areas that you're not so good at, not only does that reduce your amount of revision, but it actually helps you to focus on kind of like where you actually need that revision to be. There's other things in exam papers that are really useful to look at. And we've developed lots of resources about what are command words. What is a command word there for? Well, a command word is there to tell you how to answer that question. And there's so many resources on our website about kind of like past papers and mark like an examiner and loads of things that the kids can do. There's even interactive resources around understanding what your assessment objectives are per subject. The more a learner can learn what to expect, the less the anxiety will be.
Yeah, thank you. And Ben, can I bring you in at this point on that point about using the exam papers, past papers, to help students to understand the layout, what's expected, and perhaps to, I know this is a sort of leading question, but maybe how you model how you would tackle an exam paper for students, with thinking aloud as you work through the instructions and the command words and so on, and what Rachel has said there. So what's that look like in your teaching?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree absolutely with everything that Rachel said, and there is no one-size-fits-all way to prepare students for their exams. But all of the things she said about sort of, the things that we might take as just hygiene factors or things taken for granted are incredibly important, because sometimes we can forget that students, especially in this situation this year we're going through, they haven't had to be in this situation before. But when it comes to using past papers, I mean, I think one of the real success stories of the pandemic has been encouraging and empowering students to use online resources to help them with their studies in classes, for instance. Using past papers very often. I mean, one of the difficulties, I suppose, in my subject particularly is because there hasn't actually been that many exams in the subject in the current specification. So you're quite limited in terms of 1 or 2 past papers. So you kind of do those to death. But the way in which I've often tended to work is ultimately to kind of write out either full answers from myself to show them what a grade 9 answer or an A-star answer would look like, or to write out parts of answers and to get them to fill different bits in. And I think one of the things I often find, even with the real top end 9 grade students at GCSE or A-star at A level, is this almost this reticence about how to write an introduction. And so often I will sort of say, well, okay, let's break down this question, look at the command words. How are we then going to construct our introduction? I might write out a couple of sentence starters even just to get them started. And often I think that especially with the resources that are available there now, what is wonderful is that, going back to what Rachel said in terms of no one size fits all, there are so many different skills that students may well need to improve in terms of their own games, and whether that's in terms of their knowledge of course content, or whether it be knowledge of course skills and assessment objectives, or even just in terms of exam technique. What we can do now is provide a host of different links or websites or YouTube videos where we can say to students, if you're struggling with this, focus on this. And just to go back to the point about Rachel saying about a checklist from specifications, this is something that I've been doing certainly since I started teaching 7 years ago, which is essentially breaking specifications down into checklists and RAG rating them so that students can see for themselves where they have to go. And for us as teachers, I mean, I think, sorry to sort of labour the point, but the availability of resources, both from exam boards and publishing houses and sort of independent providers as well, has been one of the big success stories, because I think that as educators and providers of educational services, we've realised that a lot of students want additional help or will need additional help, and if we can provide that to them in a way where they can access it in their own time, it's a really empowering tool.
Thank you. And Rachel also talked about study skills, the vision technique as well, and she referenced her daughter. What's your view on that? So before we get to teaching students about how to use the exam paper and how to conduct themselves in the exam itself, what do you do in terms of arming students with a toolkit, if you like, of study skills to help them to process their notes, to test themselves, to revise ahead of exams?
So speaking just purely from my experience in what we do at my school, in sixth form, in kind of form time in the morning, so for either half an hour, 45 minutes, a few times a week, students will be introduced to different revision techniques, whether it be 2-colour pen technique or mind maps or flashcards or whatever it might be. And so they get sort of an understanding and appreciation of the variety of different kind of revision techniques that are out there. Lower down the school, what we do is once a week already in year 10. So our students start their GCSE courses in year 10. So for once a week, again, in registration, we do revision practice and revision techniques. And so sometimes that will be myself leading my form group who are year 10 through a particular technique of revising. And just giving them all the opportunity to try these things out, because they are very, very new things. And I think that point about, how do I revise is probably one of the most common questions that I would get asked at both GCSE and A level. So at my school, certainly we were introducing these things into, as I say, form time in mornings as a way to kind of almost take that away from subject teachers having to go through those techniques, which will obviously apply to a range of subjects, not just, in my instance, sociology.
Yeah, okay. So Dan, do you want to pick up on that? So you, by all means, come back on any of those points, but particularly interested to hear what you do and what works in terms of arming students with those study skills, so note-taking, self-quizzing, revising, and the importance perhaps of teaching them, spaced and interleaved practice as opposed to cramming before an exam. What do you do that works for your students?
Well, we certainly do quite a lot of the techniques that Ben's already referred to. I'm interested to hear about, the very comprehensive way in which Ben's school are covering revision. I think my school could learn something from that too. We're also sort of exploring different forms of information retrieval, certainly is something that we've been focusing on. We've got a little subgroup working on that, different sorts of quizzing, whether multiple choice is the way to go. We're experimenting with different things. Students like revision crosswords. There are a few crossword making websites, free websites that you can get on the internet, where you could just, put in your key terms and a definition and form a little crossword. Actually, the students find those really useful, which surprised me, but they love them. We're looking at dual coding quite a lot as well. I don't know if Ben, you know about the Noun project, but that's a project which has a sort of graphic little image for just about every noun that you could think of, and students then pick, the sort of combination of nouns that illustrate the point they're trying to revise. That's proved remarkably successful as well. And I know we're being encouraged to use that sort of dual coding of, visuals on PowerPoint slides, and sometimes reduce the text altogether and just try and trigger memories from an image itself, a photograph or a graphic from the Noun project. So we're just exploring different things. I've done quite a lot of kind of reading up on this before I started this year, because I think a lot of students are spending quite a lot of time just reading through notes and highlighting. And I think the research, the EEF has shown that this sort of reading and highlighting is not the best way to revise for most people. It might work. I'm very interested to hear what Rachel said about her daughter's method of just writing up her notes. I know that would work for some of my students. I also know it wouldn't work for others. So the different color pens, is better than just one highlighter pen. So have a coding system. But I think it is a very personal thing. And I think teachers have got to be willing to put in that time to work with individuals to help them find their best, way of revising. And for some, it is simply making mind maps. But for an awful lot, it isn't. And it's up to us to sort of, mix it up and just try all different things and see what we can do to help our students. Because if we don't, some of them fall by the wayside when they could have got through.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. Natasha, I will come back to you in a moment and bring you in on this, I promise. But I just want to come back to Rachel briefly first, because picking up on what Ben said a few minutes ago about the fact that one of the success stories in the last few years has been the amount of support and resources that are now provided by exam boards and other publishing houses. What do EDUCAS provide to schools to help them to explicitly teach these study skills and exam techniques to students?
So we've developed lots of exam walkthroughs and kind of that teachers can use in their classroom. And there's just loads of resources about how to break down those kind of specification into revision lists and all of those things. Like I said, we've got interactive resources on our website about assessment objectives, and different subjects will do this in different ways. We're very lucky that all of our resources on our website are free. So they're accessible to everybody. But I think we've had really positive feedback about the exam walkthroughs and how that's been really useful for both teachers and for learners, because a lot of our teachers say that they wish they could be examiners for us, but they don't have the time to do that. So they said that they've learned an awful lot by actually hearing the subject officer from EDUCAS talk through the exam and talk through what's expected from an answer. And I guess it's just a really good way of modelling in the exam and talking through kind of good approaches and good ways to do things. So yeah, I think the pandemic has really helped us all kind of like expand the resources that we were starting to develop pre-pandemic, but I think the pandemic enabled us to do that even more.
So Natasha, let me come to you. By all means, before you answer this question, do come back and comment on anything that you just heard colleagues say in this conversation. But I'm conscious that what we've covered so far is some fantastic and practical advice in terms of what teachers can do to explicitly teach students some of the skills needed to succeed in exam situations. But even if students have all of those skills at their fingertips, some students sometime will find exams stressful, that high stakes nature and that unusual situation they find themselves in. So, as I said, do come back to those early points first if you wish, but I want to ask you specifically about the mental health aspects of this topic. What would your advice be to schools to help to identify perhaps some of those stresses and anxieties that students might face? What are the telltale signs perhaps? And what can schools do to support students who do suffer from anxiety in a lead up to an exam?
Well, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I actually did bristle slightly in your introduction to this section of the podcast because you drew a very clear distinction between supporting young people academically and supporting them pastorally. And what motivated me to write my book was actually the fact that young people seem to have brought into that binary. And I don't think that it's just schools that are teaching them this. I think it's part and parcel of the culture that we live in, where we think of mental well-being or the need for mental health support as being weakness, and we praise people for working themselves to the point of burnout. But a lot of the young people that I was speaking to thought that it was a choice, a very binary choice between nurturing their mental health and performing their best in exams. And the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence shows that your academic performance and your mental health have a symbiotic relationship. If you're really invested in an element of your studies, that has a positive impact on your self-esteem, confidence, and mental health. And if you are able to reduce stress and anxiety and optimize well-being, that improves your ability to retain information, problem solve, and think creatively, because ultimately it is all your brain. So I think that the first thing to say is that we need to stop compartmentalizing it and acknowledge that supporting young people's mental health will also have a positive impact on their academic performance. And I'll just give you one very simple example of this, because I think that it's a practical thing that teachers listening can take away with them. So we should all be taking time each day to mediate the stress and anxiety that we experience. And life is stressful and stress is unavoidable. So this is the mental health equivalent of brushing your teeth. We should be ring fencing time each day to empty our stress bucket. And there are 3 particularly effective ways to empty your stress bucket. One is physical activity, another is creativity, and a third is relaxation. And these are the 3 things which are squeezed inevitably out of the school day when a school's under pressure, whether that's resource pressure, financial pressure, or academic pressure. So some of the schools that I visit have found really innovative ways to bring those activities back in a cost-effective way into the school day. And one example is doing a quick mindfulness session each day in form time. And when you go into an exam, you are inevitably in flight or fight mode because it's a weird high stakes situation, as has already been highlighted. And that's why so many people forget everything that they've learned, or don't read the question properly, or start thinking about the ways that they can escape rather than focusing on the task ahead of them. So what I say to young people is, it's actually a much better use of the first 2 to 5 minutes of your exam time to do a quick mindfulness activity to bring yourself out of flight or fight, to ensure that you are calm and focused enough to perform your best, than to get cracking straight away. But mindfulness is not a skill that you can just pull out of the bag on exam day when you need it. It's something that takes practice. So in embedding that into form time, you've not only benefited their mental health throughout the term, you've also done something that's going to help them optimize their performance in an exam scenario.
Thank you. And I'm not at all offended by the clarification. I think that was a useful way to think about it, that the 2 do not sit in opposition, they're not binary, and actually supporting students' mental health will also have a positive impact on their academic performance. Thank you for that. I'll come back to you on a few specifics then. So you talked certainly there about mindfulness, but you also talked about the importance of exercise. What else do you think we can be doing to support students in this way? So I mentioned up front about sleep and healthy eating. Is there anything else that you think that schools could be advising students on and modelling for students?
One of the key things that I focus on is helping students to discover their intrinsic motivation. They get so used to being motivated extrinsically throughout their life with things like grades and gold stars and treats. And when it comes to doing independent study or studying in the run up to exams, they're suddenly going to need to motivate themselves. So they have to understand what puts fire in their belly and ideally try and make their study look like that thing, if that makes sense. So an example would be if you have a young person who is energized by being in a group and motivated by socializing, it makes no sense for them to lock themselves away by themselves to try and study. They should be studying in a group because then it's going to feel like a social occasion for them. And the evidence shows that people who understand their intrinsic motivation not only have a higher level of well-being, but they also make better decisions throughout their lives because they make decisions with their intrinsic motivation at the forefront of their mind. And when your intrinsic motivation is being served, you feel more fulfilled and generally happier. So again, it's a really good thing to get them thinking about at a young age.
Thank you for that. And notwithstanding the comment you made earlier, which I absolutely agree with, that we can't just see the solution to all of these things as teachers need to teach more. We keep adding to the curriculum. But do you feel that in the way that we talked earlier about the importance of explicitly teaching students how to become more self-regulated, do you think we also need to teach them these strategies as well, these coping strategies? Is this something that needs to be explicitly taught to students?
I'm kind of wary of teaching young people what to do in theory without giving them the opportunity to put it into practice. And this is something that I hear sometimes when I go into a school and I do a session on stress and anxiety management. And sometimes young people will say, so what you're telling me is I need between 8 and 9 hours sleep per night. Plus I've got to do my homework. Plus I've got to find half an hour each day to empty my stress bucket. I don't have enough hours in the day. And actually, the truth is they do have enough hours in the day if they just organize their day slightly differently. But I think they need to be shown that, and it needs to be baked into the structure of how they live. So that's why I talked about schools finding innovative ways to bring exercise, physical activity, creativity, and relaxation into the structure of the school day so that they're just doing it and it forms a habit rather than learning about it in principle.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. So yes, absolutely. It's a habit, not seen as something that's in addition to, it's an add-on to what they are expected to do ordinarily. Rachel, can I bring you back in on this one then? So what would your advice be to schools to support students with anxiety and so on?
I think on top of everything that Natasha has said, I think it's about teaching learners that they can have a sense of control, because sometimes in this situation they feel they have no control. So allowing ourselves to have a sense of control actually kind of like improves our well-being. So even if that control is that I am going to take a break at this time, or I am going to choose tonight to have a bath instead of doing my revision, it's all about taking back the control. I think another thing that it's interesting, we've talked about what schools can do. As an example, we've actually done a lot of communication with parents around how they can support their children during this time. I don't think it's just down to the schools to do this. We've done a lot of articles for parents on how to spot the signs of stress and what you can do to support your learners, your children, in that situation. I think some parents worry about that they might nag too much, and how do you get that balance right? And I think it's about knowing your child as well, knowing when your child needs to take a break, encouraging them to go and stay connected with their friends, go and talk to somebody to take a break from their revision, but also being support, maybe helping them and testing them, but actually listening to them, to what best works for them, which links back to what we were saying before about that personalised approach. So I think it's not just about what schools can do, it's what parents can do to support as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that, so I suppose two linked points to that. You mentioned there about helping parents to identify some of the signs. So could you just expand on that for me, first of all? What are the telltale signs that a student might be struggling? But also, I think implicit in your answer there was that we're helping students and their parents to organise themselves, to manage their time more effectively in order to minimise some of the stresses that they might feel. What would your advice be in terms of that, time management and organisation?
Oh, so looking for the signs, I suppose, as parents, we know our children. So those signs will be different depending on your child. So if your child has always had a great routine, always played sport, and all of a sudden says, right, that all has to go, all I have to do is revise, it's about having that conversation about the benefit of still doing your sport and the benefit of still seeing your friends. And actually, a lot of parents feel that they have to tell their children that they can't go out, and that's not healthy either. So I think it's that a parent will know, spotting the signs in their own child, having that conversation with schools as well. I know a lot of schools do sessions with parents coming up to exam time over kind of like well-being and everything like that. I think it's as well about, let's take the pressure off of students. It's not about everybody getting an A. It's about everybody doing the best that they can. And this might be controversial, but I think sometimes talking about that, it might not always go the way that you want it to go, but it's not the end of the world. And that there's other things that you can do to kind of like, and to talk to people that, and I'm sure we all know somebody that can tell us the story that they didn't get to where they wanted to be first, and they learned from that experience. Exams are not the be all or end all, and they're not the only opportunity you can have to succeed. And I think it's about having those open conversations that, and I think this is what Natashas talking about. It's like that high stakes element is putting a lot of pressure on learners. Let's be realistic about what they need to do in this situation.
Yeah, definitely. Fran, do you want to come in at that point and comment on what you've just heard?
Yes, lots of really, really interesting points from colleagues there. I think one thing that just struck me as I was listening is that obviously our young people are not a homogenous group, and we do have, for example, neurodivergent children at my school. I work with a group of undiagnosed autistic learners, some with ADHD, sort of co-occurring conditions. And for those children, what motivates them can be very, very different, from what might motivate other children in the class. One decision I've had to make on more than one occasion when children have done an exam is I've had for example, an autistic student who became so passionate about the topic, who wrote so passionately, a couple of sides of A4 for a 15-mark answer, and had not, done what the exam board was looking for at all, but had shown real commitment and interest and enthusiasm and knowledge. And I didn't mark it the way an exam board marker would have done. I, gave more marks. Now you might think, gosh, that's unprofessional, but sometimes you have to reward something different from, what the exam board would be looking for under the actual exam conditions. That may be a bit left field for some people, but I've done that on more than one occasion. Then, of course, you have to sort of just, on another occasion, quietly tell that child, just make sure you've got your 3 paragraphs, and some sociologists agree, but some would disagree, rather than the whole essay on the ones who disagree. It's a tricky one, but I think we have to be aware that our learners have very different sorts of motivations sometimes, and what some might call over-enthusiasm can lead to disappointment if teachers are marking very rigidly.
So far, most of our conversation has been about how we can support students before and during an exam. So just staying with you, Fran, what would your advice be in terms of how we also support students after the exam? Now here, I'm thinking in terms of two sort of timelines. Immediately after the exam has ended, if students are panicking and are stressed about how they performed, but then longer term, when they find out the results of the exams, and perhaps they are not quite what they had hoped for and expected, what support can we put in place at that stage as well?
I think and my colleague and I always say we will be there on the day. If you can't get into the college to come and see us, email us. We will phone you immediately. We had one poor girl one year who wouldn't leave her bedroom. Her university that she targeted, had not offered her a place, and her parents were trying to talk her out. And we make ourselves available, and we are there, and we do as much as we can just to reassure. But I know I have had colleagues in the past who've literally left the country for results day so that they wouldn't be available. And I think that's a bit of a shame. I understood, why some of them have done that. But I think you've got to be there. You've told them for 2 years that this is really important and we really want you to do your best, and you've got to be there to pick up the pieces if it doesn't go well.
Thank you. Ben, can I bring you in there? So by all means, come back on any of the points that you've just heard colleagues share, but also on that specific point in terms of the aftermath of exams, the immediate and the slightly longer term aftermath. What's your advice there?
I would echo really what Fran said about just ostensibly there isn't an awful lot we can do to change the outcome, but we can be there to listen, to offer advice, to offer a bit of reassurance for students, certainly in the immediate term after an exam. In terms of the longer term, I think, again, it's a process of almost sort of preempting that what could happen. And interesting what both Rachel, Natasha and Fran have all kind of said, that it's difficult because on the one hand, schools posit these exams as the pinnacle of everything, and they are to a large extent, probably for many students at least, the biggest sort of thing they've ever had to go through in their life. But at the same time, I think often it does help sometimes to remind students that, as others have said, it's not the end of the world, and it's, you're not alone in this. And I often recount anecdotes from my own personal friends, who either those who didn't do very well in exams or didn't do particularly well in the GCSEs or didn't go to sixth form or to study A-levels, who are actually now doing incredibly successful, got their own businesses or whatever else. I often talk about another one of my friends who got not the best grade at university, but now is earning far in excess of any of my friends are. And I think it's important sometimes to remind students that that life doesn't end at the time that the exam finishes. There is life after exams, and sometimes it does take, different things work for different students, but I think sometimes just reminding them that, we've all been in this situation as well. We know people who have been in this situation, and they're not alone in this. This isn't an unusual thing. If you don't get what you want, it's not about it's about how you react to that. And I think a lot of the time it's saying to students, this could actually be an opportunity for you. Okay, perhaps you're not going to the university that you wanted to go to, but you don't know what might just be around the corner. And so trying as much as we humanly can to kind of explain to them that it isn't the end of the world. And I think that is a really, really important point. Sometimes we need to break down that smokescreen for certain students, that exams aren't necessarily the most important thing, even though they might seem like they are at the time. And that can be obviously a little bit contentious, because you don't want to belittle the gravity of exams, but at the same time you do sometimes need to take the edge off the high stakes. You need to take a few chips off the stack, so to speak, for certain students. But again, it comes back to that issue of, I think there isn't one way to handle this for a group of students. I wouldn't necessarily say all of these things to a whole group, but I might speak to a few students or those individually about these particular things. So it's a very, very tricky area, and I don't think that there is any way in which I've learned so far that it works for every student. Although if anyone knows any, I'd be very, very pleased to hear them.
Yeah, I'm sure we all will. Yeah, thank you for that. Natasha, just on that point about balancing all things, how can we strike a balance between, on the one hand, not undermining the importance of exams? We don't want to belittle the importance of that, but at the same time, we also want students to develop resilience, perhaps a growth mindset sort of approach to this, so they know it is not the end of the world. What would your advice be there?
One of the things that I try and advise schools to do in my teacher training is what I call a complement swap, which is where throughout the term or throughout their entire school career, young people are being reminded consistently about the intangible qualities that they're bringing to the table. So if they're kind, they're brave, they're insightful, they're funny, they know that about themselves, and that can never be taken away from them. Because I think what I've certainly seen I've been going into schools now since 2008, so almost a decade and a half now. And during that time, I've seen a real steep rise in perfectionism and fear of failure. And that, of course, adversely affects their academic outcomes, because people who are perfectionists don't partake in activities that they suspect they won't be the best at, because that they'd rather not try than try and fail. And perfectionists also procrastinate, which affects their ability to study, etc., etc. And I think one of the ways around this is to remind them, we're not going to lie to you. Things like what you look like, what grades you get, how much money you have does affect your life experience and the way that people treat you. However, they're not the most important things about you. And therefore, it's okay to make mistakes or to not be the best at something. That's all fine. So I think it's about kind of laying a foundation within the culture of the school where people are recognized. That it's interesting when I talk about digital citizenships to young people, I talk about the difference between recognition and validation. So recognition is when somebody sees you three-dimensionally with all of the things about yourself that you think are flaws or imperfections, and accepts you and loves you in a three-dimensional way. Validation is when you only show someone a sliver of who you are, or you pretend to be someone else and you're given praise for that aspect of yourself. And they feel similar, but they're actually polar opposites. And the best way I've ever heard it described is validation's like junk food. It's very moreish, but it's not nourishing you. And what young people really need is recognition. And the people who are around them at school have the ability to provide that recognition and say, I see you three-dimensionally.
Unbelievably, we're almost out of time, though I feel we've barely touched the surface of this subject. We do still, though, have time to hear from each of you one final time. So, Natasha, I'll stay with you if I could. So your final thoughts and top tips for me, please.
I was really pleased to hear Rachel say that if somebody's really sporty, for example, they shouldn't immediately give up all of their sporting commitments in the run up to exams, because that's my top tip for students, is to plan your study around the things that keep you sane rather than the other way around, which is the way around that most people do it. And that's probably my top tip for any young learner. And in terms of my final thought, I think I've already said it, that we should stop thinking of mental health and well-being as being an add-on to the academic and learning experience, and start seeing it as being integral to it.
Thank you for that. That's fantastic. Ben, your final thoughts, please.
Final thoughts. Thank you very much, firstly, for inviting us on this. I found this to be a really insightful conversation, and I've written down so many little things as I've been going through this, which has been really, really handy for me. I think my kind of final top tip, really, I suppose for teachers more than students, but students as well. But students and teachers should be aware of the wealth of quality of support, information, advice, assistance that's available online, and a lot of it doesn't need to be read. So many excellent YouTube channels out there, so many great podcasts out there that can help them with their exam content, skills, assessment skills, and their revision. So something I'd say is always, if you want to get away and just think about other things, put a podcast on, go and walk the dog, go for a wander. It will help you immensely, and it won't even feel like you're doing work or revision.
Thank you so much for that. Dan, same to you. Your final thoughts, top tips, please.
Right. Again, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you tonight. I would very much echo what Ben said about, going online, listening to podcasts, go down the auditory route. But I think my biggest top tip for teachers is just be there, be present for the young people you teach. I think sometimes, all of us sort of fall into the trap of thinking we're preparing students for the future. It's all about the future. It's actually about the here and now. I spend longer some days with this, my students than I do with my husband. This is now. This is our lives now. Ask them about other things that are not anything to do with school. Listen to what they're saying. If they say something to you about what they're doing at the weekend, try to remember and ask them about it. I've found that reaps enormous rewards in terms of students' well-being. I've been trying to do that quite mindfully really now for the last few years. So that would be my top tip for teachers.
Thank you so much for that. And it seems apt in a podcast about exams to leave the final word to the exam board. So Rachel, your final thoughts?
Gosh, no pressure at all after all those fantastic top tips from everybody. I think it's about, for teachers, remembering that students are not robots. They're all different. And I loved all the ideas that Ben and Fran talked about of how to approach revision. It's about talking about all those different ways and allowing learners to take back control by choosing what is best for them and knowing that there are resources out there for them that will help them.
Thank you for listening to the SecEd podcast. This episode was sponsored by Educas, and I sat down with Hugh Lester of Educas to chat some more about the work of the awarding body. Hugh, it's good to speak to you. Do you want to say a little bit about what you do at Educas, first of all?
Yes, of course. My official job title is England Stakeholder Engagement Executive, which is quite a mouthful. But basically, it means that I'm responsible for looking after our engagement with stakeholders in England. And a very large part of that job is managing our team of regional representatives.
So that support team that you manage, what do they do exactly? And specifically from the point of view of schools, teachers and leaders, what kind of help can they access through your team?
Yeah, okay, it's a small team. We set it up, I think it was back in 2015. And the idea was to support teachers of Educas qualifications. That was the time when we were introducing the Educas brand, and we thought it was very important to support teachers as they began to teach our qualifications. Our main roles are supporting existing teachers, but we also help those moving on to an Educas qualification, or if people are just interested in finding out more, we can go in and tell them about our qualifications and resources. There are 5 of us and we work in different regions of England, but also some of us specialise in certain of our key subject areas. We're all former teachers. That helps us to help teachers in a practical and well-informed way. And we can do that either online or by visiting teachers in their school or college. We also attend exams officer meetings and conferences, and we run a few teach meets, which is an opportunity for teachers to share ideas in various subjects. Whichever way you decide to engage with us, you'll find us, I hope, friendly, informal, and perhaps most importantly, completely free of charge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to know. Thank you for that. So I presume teachers can access that support at all times, but you'll be aware from the interview in this podcast that we've been talking about the anxiety that some students face in the lead up to exams. So just thinking about this term ahead, as we head towards those exams, what support specifically might teachers be able to access from your team to help their students better prepare for exams?
Yes, I mean, we think that's really important. Obviously, teachers are the key people in supporting their students, and we hope that we can support teachers to do that. We can help in various ways. If you're thinking about using an Educas qualification, we can come in and tell you more and help you make the right decision for your students. So obviously this is the time of the year you might be thinking about that. I promise you there's no hard sell. We just come in and tell you about our qualifications and leave you to make the decision about what's best for your students. If you've already decided to move across to us, we can help you with planning, identifying resources, explaining the assessment. And if you're already with us, which is perhaps the key element to the question that you asked, we can point you in the right direction for resources to support your students. We can advise you on best practice. We can help you set up a network to meet up with other teachers. And perhaps most importantly, we can answer any questions and address any anxieties that you might have.
Tell me a little bit more about those resources that you have available through the website. You said you have 3 resources available to anyone, whether they use Educast or not, and I understand there are planning resources and knowledge organisers and such like. Do you want to just explain a little bit about what is available?
Yes, I mean, the knowledge organisers are a very, very useful tool, both for teachers and for students, because it, well, in a way it does what it says on the tin. It shows students and teachers the kind of knowledge that's required for a particular assessment in a particular qualification. We've also got exam walkthroughs in some subjects where we, again, fairly self-explanatory, we go through the exams explaining what the assessment is, how it works, how best to answer particular questions. And we've got a lot of other more general resources, not completely focused on assessment, which are very useful in the classroom as teachers prepare students to sit exams. And obviously the nature of those varies subject to subject, but the feedback we get is that teachers find them very, very useful.
Yeah, I can imagine so. And in the conversation we had earlier in this podcast, we talked about the importance of helping students, particularly those this year who haven't sat exams before, to understand how to navigate an exam paper and the exam hall routines and so on. So the materials that you have on the website, as we say, free of charge for teachers to access, they provide, I understand, PowerPoints that walk students through the exam papers and so on, so that teachers don't have to create these resources for themselves. They can download them and use them immediately with their classes. Is that the case? Have I understood that correctly?
Absolutely, yes, that's exactly right.
Thank you. And likewise for the planning materials that students themselves can use, so to help them to manage their time, to organise their notes and so on, is that something that students can also access through the website?
Yes, and in fact on the digital resources website, we've identified the resources which we think are perhaps particularly useful for students to use, either under supervision or indeed on their own, if they're so inclined.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you may feel you've answered this question, at least in part, but I'll ask the question anyway. What do you think sets Educast apart from other awarding bodies?
Yeah. I think I have touched on that. I think the most important thing is the direct access that we offer to our subject officers. And like the regional team, all the subject officers have been teachers themselves as well. Happy to answer any question, and no question is too small. Our job is to help and to support teachers, and we're happy to do that. We're quite a small exam board, which is a good thing, I think, and so therefore we are small enough to maintain this personal touch. But we have got a wealth of experience of assessment and teaching. But you don't have to go through a call centre or anything to get in touch with somebody who can help and who knows what they're talking about. We have got a wide range of digital resources, and all of these are free of charge. That includes, as we've mentioned, the exam walkthroughs, knowledge organisers, also online exam review, which is a set of exemplar responses with commentary, and question bank in some subjects, which is a tool which allows teachers to create their own question papers for use with students. We've also got endorsed textbooks for many of our qualifications, and we run a full programme of CPD training, both online and returning to some face-to-face events this coming autumn, we hope. And finally, I have to big up my regional team again. We've got a very responsive regional team who are happy to talk to teachers online or face-to-face.
Fantastic. And just finally then, where can our listeners, those teachers and school leaders, find out more information?
Right. I suppose the best thing to do is to visit our website, first of all. That's educast.co.uk, where there are links to all our resources, our specifications, our teacher guides, and to the regional and subject teams, and a lot more besides. But I'm also happy to be contacted directly, and my email address is hugh.lester@educast.co.uk.
And that's it for this edition of the SecEd podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to visit the SecEd website for more top tips on this subject and indeed on a whole host of other topics pertinent to secondary school practitioners. The website is sec-ed.co.uk. The SecEd podcast is free to download from your usual streaming service, but you can also access all of our past podcasts on the SecEd website. You'll also find on that website our best practice articles and downloads and details of our free weekly e-bulletin. You can follow us on Twitter as well at SecEd_education. I've been Matt Bromley. You can find out more about me and what I do on my website, which is bromleyeducation.co.uk. And you can follow me on Twitter too at MJ_Bromley. But that's it, as I say, for this edition of the podcast. Thank you once more for listening. I do appreciate it, and I've enjoyed your company today. But until next time, take care of yourselves, and goodbye.